Hello and welcome. Today we are going to talk about the history of Halloween, and I'm going to tell the story through four objects. So, to start with, here in Montana, I am Mrs. Delaney, but if we were in Ireland, I would go by Ban E. Delaney, which is the Irish translation to say the wife of Delaney. Here I am Mrs. Delaney, there Ban E. Delaney. So, just like that, there are many traditions that exist here in the United States that have a history that comes from far off places. So, today we are going to get started with the history of Halloween. Now, Halloween is a very interesting holiday because it is a combination of so many different cultures and different beliefs. It has changed dramatically over time, and that is partially because of how people move from one part of the world to the next. So the beginning of our story does not happen in the United States because the United States did not exist. Instead, it happens long, long, long ago on an island that today we call Ireland. Now, it wasn't just something that happened in Ireland. It happened through much of Western Europe and up into Scotland. And it was something celebrated by the ancient Celts. The Celtic people were actually over a huge space of what today we know as Europe and some of the British Isles. But thousands of years ago, there were actually quite a few Celtic peoples, and each one of them had their own slight different variations of beliefs. What we do know is that these people brought with them their traditions and their culture to Ireland. So, to start my story, a long, long time ago in Ireland, I would say fado, fado in era, long, long ago in Ireland. At the time of the Celts, they believed that this was the time of year where you switched from the spring and summer to the winter time. Now, spring and summer is a time of growing, of life, but at the end of fall, you enter a time period where nothing grows, and they called that the time of death. Now, it wasn't supposed to be like an ooh, scary time of death. It was simply that everything goes in a cycle. You have birth and life and death, and then in the springtime, everything will come back again and go through the same cycle over and over and over again. But in order for that to happen, we have to go through this time period where we are in the season of death. Now, in between the season of life and the season of death, there is a moment where we are shifting into the new year. And the belief was at that time, as we were in the middle of shifting from life to death, was when those two worlds were the closest to each other, and that perhaps some of the spiritual beings could come into the world of the living, and it would be possible for someone from the world of the living to accidentally find themselves in the spirit world. Now, we don't know exactly what the celebration was because many of the traditions of the ancient Celtic people have since been lost. But we do know from some reports that were written by Catholic missionaries and priests that it involved a very big bonfire. So my first object to understand the history of Halloween is fire. In Irish, instead of the word fire, I would say tinna. So tinna, or fire, is a sign of the light, of the life that humans are going into wintertime, hoping that spring comes back again. Now, the ancient Celtic people never entirely felt that spring was guaranteed. They didn't know if the sun was going to return to the world. And so going into the long length of winter, when the days get shorter and the nights get longer, there was some general concern that maybe springtime wouldn't come back again, and that they needed to make sure that they did everything correctly so that that light would return to the world. And so we still celebrate with bonfires, or in this case, just a simple candle. And you'll notice that a lot of Halloween decorations involve candles as a symbol of light. So as the darkness begins, and as we enter the time of the year where things are not growing, we enter the time of death, we enter it with hope. Hope that things will get better and hope that the springtime will come, hope that light will return, and that we will once again enjoy the season of life. So the candle reminds us of hope. Now, from there, the Irish peoples were introduced to a new culture and a new spiritual belief system by our second object here in our storytelling, a fellow named St. Patrick. St. Patrick was not actually Irish. He was from Wales. He was a Welshman. He was originally brought over as a slave, escaped, and then felt that he was sent back to Ireland to spread the good word amongst the Irish pagans. Now, as he came over, you can see my little guy here is holding a little four-leaf clover, and they used that as a way of teaching. So the shamrock specifically was used supposedly by St. Patrick to help teach the Irish people about the Catholic faith. And so in Irish, we would say it shamrock. In English, we say it shamrock. So shamrock is what we use to help tell the story of how we have a new system of belief that is coming to the Irish people. This is a major change in Irish culture. The introduction of Catholicism has an impact even to the very language itself. When I greet my friends, my shirt says speak Irish with me, by the way. When I greet my Irish-speaking friends, I say, Dia gwit. And then to me, they respond, Dia ismiragwit. That is how you say hello. Oh, hello to you too. The literal translation, Dia gwit, is God to you. And Dia ismiragwit is God and Mary to you. So even the language changes when we have the introduction of the Catholic Church to Ireland. Now, as these people were traveling about trying to convince all the Irish people to join their faith, they discovered that some of these ancient Celtic traditions were not going to go away anytime soon. So one of the popes, Gregory, had a very genius idea. If we just change the date of a holiday that is already in the Catholic Church and is similar, then we know that these folks here are going to happily join us in celebrating it. So the church decided that they would start celebrating the Mass of all the Holy Saints to coincide with the original Celtic holiday of Samhain. So now we have a tradition, Samhain, that is being combined with the Holy Catholic All Saints' Day or All Hallows' Day. Now, All Hallows' Eve is the night before the celebration, and especially in places like in Scotland, they would use the word even for evening. And so All Hallows' Even would get shortened down to Halloween. So that is where we get the modern term for Halloween. But at this point in our story, we're still thousands of miles on a tiny island, very, very far from Helena, Montana. So how does Halloween get here? Well, that is where we enter our third item to tell the story, the humble potato. Now, in Irish, potatoes is said protí, and protí are extremely important in Irish history. If it weren't for the potato, things would have happened very, very differently. Now, interesting tidbit about the potato is it is not native to Ireland. It is not native to anywhere in Europe. This comes from the Americas. This was truly an American food that grew here for thousands and thousands of years. And it was not until Europeans began bringing things back to Europe that the humble potato found its way to Ireland. Now, when it did make its way to Ireland, it revolutionized the way that people ate there. And unfortunately for the Irish people, it also had a huge impact on the tragedy that we refer to as the Great Potato Famine. Now, at that point in history, around about 1845 to 1849, the Irish people had no control over their own country and homeland. The English had conquered it, and the English had a series of laws that were trying to create a world without Irish culture. So it was illegal to speak the Irish language. They were trying to end Irish culture, and Irish people were not allowed to own their land anymore. It was all owned by the English. The English controlled what foods could be grown and what foods could be sold. And the long and short of it is, the majority of the Irish population was literally surviving on only potatoes, occasionally a bit of milk. Potatoes and milk, proti agus banya, is not a healthy way to survive by any means. And unfortunately, they ended up experiencing a potato blight, where the potato plants didn't grow one year. The top looked fine, but the roots, the bottom part where the potatoes grow, didn't grow right. And they didn't know until fall came. And when they tried to harvest the plants, whole fields that people needed to survive the winter yielded no potatoes. There's literally nothing for the majority of Irish people that they are allowed to eat. So when the potato crops fail, and they failed year after year throughout the end of the 1840s, this created a desperate situation. Many of them determined that the only way that they could help their families was to leave Ireland. So they left their homelands, and this is when the Irish begin spreading out throughout many different parts of the world, and many of them came out to the American West. You see, what is today Canada was part of the English Empire, and it was fairly easy to cross the Atlantic from Ireland over to New York in the United States or into Canada. That's how my relatives got here, in fact. So as people were attempting to escape the potato famine, many of them came to what was then the United States of America. And this is when the potato brings with it a whole bunch of Irish people. So it's an American food that goes to Ireland and then ends up coming back with a bunch of Irish people. Now here in the United States, those immigrants brought with them much of their culture. They brought with them their traditions, their beliefs, and they needed to survive. So for many people, they were simply trying to look for a better place where they could get a job, they could send money home, they could make sure that their family members were not going to go hungry. And somehow that turned into Halloween. So how exactly did that happen? Well, the Irish communities continue to celebrate their All Saints' Day and Samhain festivities. And in many cases, people would have young children who would go around shenanigans, mischief, mostly harmless pranks. However, by the time you get to the 1930s, some of these pranks were no longer harmless. It used to be that kids might come and take the gate off of your fence, and then they'd run off and giggle, and then the next day they'd put it back. But by the 1930s, some of them were actually causing quite a lot of actual damage. They were vandalizing. And sometimes they would come, knock on the door, and ask the people who lived there, trick or treat. If you don't give us something, we're going to trash your house. So trick-or-treating did not necessarily start out as a very fun activity. It was more like bribery. However, there were a lot of people who didn't want young children to have this whole evening where they could run amok, which seems very logical. And they felt they just needed a better way to spend their time. So we go back to some of the older traditions. There was one called guising, where people would put on masks and go from house to house, entertaining each other. So kind of like trick-or-treating wearing masks today. There was also a tradition called souling, where especially young children and especially poor children would go around to house begging for food. And in return, they said, we will pray for your relatives who have passed away. So in exchange for our extra prayers, if you would give us something to eat, then we will make a lovely arrangement. And so these traditions end up becoming what we today know as trick or treat. And specifically, if you were going to say that in Irish, it would be bub no bia. So trick, bub, or treat, food is bia. So bub no bia would be how you would say trick or treat. And today we have simple, fun candies And we get to go around in masks and we make an exchange, trick or treat, although you better not be doing anything that would be of vandalism nature in your tricking. So a little bit of shenanigans is always loved in Irish culture, but you definitely shouldn't be anything that is going to be seen as less than respectful. So here we have the history of Halloween in 4 objects. From the original Samhain festival, created and celebrated by the ancient Celts as they hoped that the sun would return for the next year. We have the traditions brought by the Catholic Church and St. Patrick, and the connection with the Holy Mass of All Saints' Day. We have the humble potato, prata, and it brings back the people to the countries that the potato originally came from. Bit of a homecoming for potatoes. And then we have Bubnobia, trick or treating, and the fun that we get to do today, especially bobbing for apples and gathering together, storytelling with friends, and remembering those who have gone before us. Because in all of these traditions, it all is about family, of about spending time together, of getting to hear the stories of our loved ones, and of getting to share those stories with the new young kids and having a little bit of fun, maybe a little bit of mischief, but mostly spending time with loved ones.